Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today's episode carries on more or less from episode 78, U.S. Pop Culture 1985 Part 3, as we begin our deep dive into U.S. pop culture in the year 1986, laying context for a discussion of the Beach Boys' recorded work released during that year. Now, 1986 was certainly not a stellar year for the Beach Boys. There was no new original Beach Boy album released during the year, but it was an interesting year. They released a couple of new singles. There was yet another best of package, and there were some unusual releases. So I think what we'll do is we will talk about the first 3 quarters of U.S. pop culture over the next several episodes. Then we'll talk about all the Beach Boy recorded work released during that year, most of which came out in the 3rd quarter. Then we will return to wind up with a look at pop culture in the 4th quarter of the year. Of course, along the way, during these pop culture episodes, we'll be checking in with what the Beach Boys were up to during those periods. So there is obviously a lot to get to. Let's get started. As 1986 began, Ronald Reagan was nearly 25% of the way through his 2nd term as president. The AIDS epidemic continued, and the media featured stories on the rise of crack cocaine. Number 1 on the nonfiction bestseller list is the autobiography of auto industry executive Lee Iacocca. 37% of households with a TV also have a VCR, and with the machines becoming less expensive, that number is growing fast. Wine coolers are in vogue, and on the road you'll spot plenty of baby on board signs in car windows. For clothing, pastels are still the thing, especially for the t-shirts men wear under their jackets with the sleeves pushed up, Don Johnson style. Later in 1986, Timbuk 3 will proclaim that the future's so bright they gotta wear shades. They might also want to wear those shades to look at the bright and day-glow colors and wild patterns that will become increasingly popular as the year goes on. So now, veg out and chill as we explore the highs, the lows, the rad and the gnarly. Welcome to 1986. As usual, we'll start at the beginning with the months of January, February, and March, looking at music, movies, television, the news, and of course what the Beach Boys were up to. In contrast to the other 3 quarters of the year, the Beach Boys seemingly weren't up to much in the 1st quarter. There were a handful of Beach Boy concerts in the first 3 months of 1986, including a 3-night stint at Harrah's Tahoe in late January. Mostly, it appears that they were getting some R&R before embarking on another major tour in May. There was one event, sadly, that came to dominate news in the 1st quarter. On January 28th, in a terrible tragedy, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart a little more than 1 minute after lifting off, killing all 7 astronauts aboard, including the woman who was to have been America's first private citizen to travel in space, schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe. The average price of a movie ticket in 1986 was $3.71. Hollywood seemed to be cracking along, turning out comedies, dramas, science fiction, fantasy, and romance. There was plenty of variety, some unique concepts, and also plenty of movies derivative of earlier hits. The top 24 or so stars seemed to be busily cranking out 2 or 3 movies a year. Movies still going strong at the box office as the year began included Spies Like Us, a comedy starring Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase. Steven Spielberg's The Color Purple, starring Danny Glover and Whoopi Goldberg. Out of Africa, a romantic drama starring Robert Redford and Meryl Streep. And Sylvester Stallone's Rocky IV, which was number 1 at the box office as the year began. Big new movie releases in the 1st quarter included on January 17th, Clan of the Cave Bear, a Stone Age adventure featuring Daryl Hannah as a Cro-Magnon woman being raised by Neanderthals. It didn't get great reviews or make a lot of money, but the movie poster was memorable. Released on January 31st, a much bigger hit, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, starring Bette Midler, Richard Dreyfuss, and Nick Nolte, and based on Jean Renoir's 1932 film, Baudou Saved from Drowning. Beverly Hills Cop had made Beverly Hills a hip and bankable phrase, and I'm sure that factored into the selection of the title. On February 7th came Hannah and Her Sisters, Woody Allen's acclaimed new film featuring an ensemble cast. At the Academy Awards presentation on March 8, 1987, it earned Best Supporting Actor Oscars for Michael Caine and Diane Wiest. On February 21st, 9.5 Weeks, a provocative drama starring Mickey Rourke and Kim Basinger. They broke every rule. On February 28th, Pretty in Pink, another look at modern teenage life written by John Hughes following up his big hit from last year, The Breakfast Club. This one also starred Molly Ringwald. On March 7th, we got Highlander, an adventure fantasy starring Christopher Lambert and Sean Connery. Also released that day was A Room with a View, an English period romance from the production direction team of Merchant Ivory. They'll find much acclaim and success with their period adaptations of English literature over the next decade or so. This one starred Maggie Smith, Denholm Elliott, and introduced newcomer Helena Bonham Carter. Released on March 26th was The Money Pit, a comedy starring Shelley Long from Cheers and Tom Hanks, probably best known at this time as the star of 1984's Splash. Turning to music, the top 10 albums on that first chart of the year, January 11th, were at number 1, the Miami Vice soundtrack album. It had been number 1 for 10 of the last 11 weeks. It'll spend one more week at number 1. At number 2, the Broadway album by Barbra Streisand, which will replace Miami Vice in the number 1 spot on January 25th and stay there for 3 weeks. Heart's self-titled album had knocked the Miami Vice soundtrack out of the number 1 spot for 1 week back on December 21st, 1985. It was at number 3. John Cougar Mellencamp's Scarecrow album was at number 4. It had peaked at number 2 for 3 weeks beginning November 16th. Afterburner by ZZ Top was at number 5. It had spent 3 weeks at number 4 beginning December 7th. At number 6 was Dire Straits' Brothers in Arms album. This had been number 1 for 9 weeks beginning back on August 31st, 1985. At number 7 was Stevie Wonder's In Square Circle album. This had peaked at number 5 back on November 30th of 85. And at number 8 was Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. In an era of big albums, this was one of the biggest. It had been number 1 for the entire month of July 1984, shortly after its release, and then stayed at number 2 behind Purple Rain for most of the rest of the year. On January 19, 1985, it had returned to the number 1 spot for another 3 weeks, and had been bouncing around in the top 10 ever since. It'll finally drop out of the top 10 on February 1st, 1986. And number 9 was Knee Deep in the Hoopla by Starship. It'll spend 3 weeks at number 7 beginning March 1st. Hanging in at number 10 was Songs from the Big Chair by Tears for Fears. This had been number 1 for 4 weeks beginning back on July 13th, 1985, and again for a week on August 24th, 1985. In top 10 singles on that first chart of the year, at number 1 was Say You, Say Me by Lionel Richie. From the film White Nights, it was in the last of its 3 weeks at the number 1 spot. At number 2 was Party All the Time by Eddie Murphy. According to Exhibitor polls, Eddie Murphy had been the number 2 box office draw of 1985 behind Sylvester Stallone. Naturally, a record wasn't far behind. He'd end up at an impressive number 2 here also. As 1986 began, Party All the Time was in the last of its 3 weeks at its number 2 peak. At number 3, That's What Friends Are For. Dionne Warwick's single for AIDS research and prevention featuring Elton John, Gladys Knight, and Stevie Wonder. It'll go to number 1 the next week, January 18th, and stay at number 1 for 4 weeks. At number 4 was Alive and Kicking by the Simple Minds, which had peaked at number 3 back on December 28th. I Miss You by Climax was in the third of its 4-week run at number 5. Small Town by John Cougar Mellencamp was in the third of a 4-week run at number 6. And Tonight She Comes by The Cars was at its number 7 peak. Talk to Me by Stevie Nicks was at number 8. It'll go to number 4 for 2 weeks beginning January 25th. And Broken Wings by Mr. Mister was at number 9. It had been number 1 for the first 2 weeks of December 1985. Rounding out the top 10 was Walk of Life by Dire Straits. It'll hit number 7 on January 25th. Top 10 singles that will come and go in the first quarter include My Hometown by Bruce Springsteen, his 7th and final top 10 hit from the Born in the USA album. It'll spend 2 weeks at number 6 beginning January 25th. Burning Heart by Survivor from Rocky IV. It's not quite the number 1 smash that their Eye of the Tiger from Rocky III had been back in '82, but it'll do pretty well, spending the first 2 weeks of February at number 2. I'm Your Man by Wham will spend the first 2 weeks of February at number 3. Go Home by Stevie Wonder will reach number 10 on February 2nd. As things transpire, it'll end up being his last top 10 hit to date. Spies Like Us by Paul McCartney will go to number 7 on February 8th. It's from the Chevy Chase Dan Aykroyd comedy of the same name. Speaking for myself, and I'm very much a McCartney fan, this is probably my least favorite McCartney A-side of all time, and that includes We All Stand Together. Getting back to top 10 hits, the Miami Sound Machine, a new act, was having their first hit with Conga. It'll reach number 10 on February 8th and stay there for 2 weeks. How Will I Know by Whitney Houston will spend the second 2 weeks of February at number 1. When the Going Gets Tough, Jewel of the Nile Theme by Billy Ocean, another film soundtrack song, will go to number 2 on February 15th. Life in a Northern Town by Dream Academy will spend the last 2 weeks of February at number 7. Cartier by Mr. Mister will spend the first 2 weeks of March at number 1. And James Brown was back with his first top 40 hit in 12 years with Living in America, another song from Rocky IV. It'll go to number 4 on March 1st. It'll end up being James Brown's last time in the top 40. The Sweetest Taboo by Sade will go to number 5 on March 1st. Silent Running on Dangerous Ground by Mike and the Mechanics will go to number 6 on March 8th. Mike Rutherford showed that Phil Collins was not the only Genesis member who could have hits on the side in the 1980s. This was yet another song from a film soundtrack. Sarah, Sarah by Starship will hit number 1 on March 15th. King for a Day by the Thompson Twins will go to number 8 on March 22nd, and This Could Be the Night by Loverboy will peak at number 10 on March 29th. Of course, there were a lot of 1985 albums still climbing the chart as the year began. Albums from 1985 that would peak early in 1986 included Dionne Warwick's Friends album, which will go to number 11 early in 1986, Charlie Sexton's Pictures for Pleasure, which will go to number 13 early in the year, and Listen Like Thieves by In Excess, which will go to number 11. Released on January 2nd of 86 was the Bangles' Different Light album. This will take a long time climbing the charts, finally peaking at number 2 on January 31st, 1987, more than a year after its release. Also released in January was the Fabulous Thunderbirds' Tough Enough album. This will take a few months climbing the chart, finally reaching number 13 in the spring. And released on February 4th was Janet Jackson's Control album. Released on February 10th, The Ultimate Sin by Ozzy Osbourne. The Pretty in Pink soundtrack was released on February 28th. It'll spend the entire month of May at number 5. Van Halen's 5150 album, their first album with new lead singer Sammy Hagar, will be released on March 24th. As will Dirty Work by the Rolling Stones, generally regarded as another disappointing album from the Stones, maybe even more so than their last 1983's Undercover. Nevertheless, it'll spend the first 2 weeks of May at number 4. Also released on March 24th was the Pet Shop Boys' Please album. This will reach number 7 on June 21st. And on the last day of the quarter, March 31st, we got Prince and the Revolution's Parade album. If last year's Around the World in a Day had been seen as something of a come down after Purple Rain, this was seen as something of a come down after Around the World in a Day. Nevertheless, there's some great stuff here, and it will spend the first 3 weeks of May at number 3. On television in the first quarter, networks began rolling out mid-season replacements for some of their flops. On February 27th came the premiere of You Again on NBC, starring former Oscar Madison and Quincy M.E. Jack Klugman and former General Hospital star John Stamos as an estranged father and son trying to live together. The show will only last until the second week of January 1987, so it wasn't particularly successful or memorable, but I wanted to mention it because, as you might have guessed with John Stamos in it, there's a Beach Boy connection that we'll get to in the third and fourth quarters of 1986. On Saturday, March 1st, came the premiere of Valerie on NBC. It was another family sitcom in the vein of The Cosby Show, Family Ties, and Growing Pains. It starred the former Rhoda Morgenstern, Valerie Harper, as Valerie Hogan. Second billed was young Jason Bateman, brother of Family Ties star Justine Bateman, as David, the oldest of her 3 sons. On Tuesday, March 25th, another mid-season replacement sitcom, Perfect Strangers, debuts on ABC. It's both a fish out of water and a buddy comedy about an Eastern European shepherd who moves in with his American cousin. Bronson Pinchot starred as Cousin Balki, sort of reprising his small but memorable quirky foreigner role as Serge in Beverly Hills Cop. Of course, this being a TV series, they had to devise more of a backstory for him, which made him less enigmatic and somehow less funny. The series will draw strong, if not stellar ratings, and will run until 1993. In the wake of 1984's Band-Aid, 1985's USA for Africa and the Live Aid concerts came Comic Relief. Comic Relief was founded in the UK in 1985. Comic Relief USA was started in 1986. Their first event was a 3-hour benefit for the homeless broadcast on HBO on March 29th. It was hosted by Billy Crystal, Whoopi Goldberg, and Robin Williams. Featured were George Carlin, Gary Shandling, Sid Caesar, Jerry Lewis, Pee Wee Herman, Bobcat Goldthwait, Mary Gross, and John Lovitz from Saturday Night Live, and many, maybe too many others. There was certainly a lot of talent there, but I have to say, I didn't really find it that funny. It was kind of like going into a restaurant and ordering everything on the menu. Any 2 or 3 items might have been tasty, but this much just made you want to throw up. So that gives us a start on looking at 1986. Obviously, there's much more to come. Next time we'll carry on with the second quarter of the year and move on into the third quarter. I look forward to your comments. Please hit like if you don't mind and subscribe if you haven't. Have a great week. We will see you next time for the second quarter of 1986. Bye.